Welcome to the Homesteading for Beginners podcast. This is Mona Weathers, your host, and I am a homesteading coach teaching beginner homesteaders how to start and maintain a healthy homestead that aligns with their goals for self-sufficiency in a way that is sustainable and profitable. If that describes you, then you are in the right place. So let's get started with the topic today. Gardening tends to be one of the very first skills learned by new homesteaders, because it is kind of the gateway drug. I know a lot of people say chickens are, but I think it's actually gardening. It could be sourdough bread making, but regardless of how you get started with your homesteading journey, the gardening is important. It's important to know how to grow your own food, whether that's in, the windowsill of your house or in a full-on huge garden on your homestead. Some people seem to have this intuitive nature about them and they know how to garden from the start. They just, they're called green thumb people, but I think what they are really is observant. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because I want to turn, if you are a believer that you have a black thumb, I want to turn you into a green thumb gardener. So if you struggle to keep your seedlings alive and having them grow, or growing from seed and you just feel like it's such a struggle and it's such a hard thing, I'm going to help you learn some things from a seasoned gardener that will help you have this foundation of information that will help you to be a better gardener. So my goal today is to turn those black thumbs into green thumbs with this information. These tips are for anyone, not just those that have deemed themselves black thumb gardeners. And so I just want you to know that. If you've been gardening for a long time, you might find some of the things I'm sharing useful. I have been gardening for 16 years, but I am not an expert. I still am mastering this skill. But I've been doing it for long enough to feel like there's these patterns that I do, and I notice that some people might not understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So I wanted to share that with you because it's helped me to be able to grow things fairly easy. But if you are interested in real in-depth gardening tips and information about gardening, I highly recommend you listen to episode 82 of this podcast with Jessica Gaige. I did an episode with her, and she also has a full podcast with lots of episodes about organic gardening, and it's called Organic Gardening for Beginners. So I will leave the links in the show notes so that you can check that out. But if you want just more in-depth information on gardening, that's the place to go. I'm just giving you some tips here today that have helped me over the years, and I hope you enjoy them. I can't talk about gardening and not mention my mother-in-law, who has since passed away. She was 94 years old when she passed away a few years ago. She is very much missed, but she also is the one that really got me into a lot of the homesteading skills that I have today. She taught me how to can, she taught me how to crochet, she taught me about gardening. So I just think about her a lot when I'm gardening. I'm getting to the age where I feel like I'm shuffling and puttering around. And I think about her a lot when I do that. I'm shuffling and puttering around the garden, picking up weeds and volunteer plants and moving them into bigger pots and that sort of thing. And my mother-in-law grew up in an age where, she was in the Depression era. They were, just to clear this up in case you're wondering, time frame. My mother-in-law had my husband at age 45. So he grew up with all of his nieces and nephews as siblings, kind of. They were he was a lot younger than his own siblings, so he grew up with their children. So that explains that. So if you're wanting to know how did we have that, that sounds more like a grandparent age. That's why. Anyway, they grew up, her and my father-in-law grew up in the Depression era, where they were pretty much poor all the time. So they didn't actually notice that much difference in their lives. My oldest daughter had the pleasure of interviewing them for a school project many years ago, and it was about living in the Depression era. And they both said we didn't notice. They were still children. They weren't adults, but they didn't really notice much difference because they were already poor. They were already growing food from their garden. They were already doing those things. But she just had been gardening. Both of them had been gardening for many, many years. And I just learned a lot from her just by watching her. And she loved plants. Like, she would be walking around the garden or anywhere and see a plant and just like scoop it up. She'd be like, oh, there's a volunteer. And she'd scoop it up and put it into another pot. She just had this way about her. And so I have learned a few tips from her from that, as well as just my own 16 or so years of gardening, learned my own tips as well. So today I'm just going to share some of that. So I'm not going to share do this, do that, do that. It's more of what I'm sharing is how to be a gardener. But first, before we go on, I want to introduce you to my grandson, Echo.
Hi.
Came while I was recording, and I just want you to know that these are the sounds and the memories that I'm going to enjoy so much when I hear these episodes in the future. So, Echo, say hi.
Hi.
Echo is learning new languages like Spanish, and he is using the app called Duolingo. And we are both doing it. I'm learning German and he's learning Spanish. So he gets really excited when he accomplishes something big in his Duolingo. So what did you just do today?
I got a 12-day streak.
Yeah, he got a 12-day streak. That means he's been working on his Duolingo for 12 days straight. Awesome, buddy.
Thanks.
I love you.
Bye.
Okay, I hope you didn't mind that little interruption. I do love it when my grandkids come and say hi to me while I'm doing my podcast episodes. I have other episodes with my other granddaughter, Zinnia, as well. So anyway, let's get back to the topic. What I'm trying to teach you here is that there are things that gardeners do and just kind of naturally know how to do, but it takes time and practice. It takes a lot of failure too to be able to learn from your mistakes as well. So the sooner you get started, the better. I always say that with gardening, don't wait on gardening. Might want to wait on raising animals, but don't wait on gardening. Gardening you can do from anywhere. You can start and you can learn what plants look like, what they're supposed to look like when they're healthy, what the soil is supposed to look like when it's healthy, and that sort of thing. So my first tip for you today is to use your senses. So we're going to use our senses to determine the health of plants, the health of soil, and just overall health of your homestead, right? So use your senses. Look, feel, smell, and listen. Now you're probably wondering how you can smell and listen, but I will get into that more in a little bit. So you want to be able to use all of your senses when you are observing plants, and this will help you to not just follow instructions in a manual or in a book on a how to garden book. It's not the how to, it's the aligning your whole being to knowing whether a plant is growing well or if it's not growing well. And that's not something that it can be taught for sure. And some people, like I mentioned earlier, seem to have it naturally, and some people have to learn it. So if you're not really good at observing and taking the time to observe, this might be a stretch for you, but it's certainly possible. I'm going to start with seedlings and soil because that's kind of the time we're in right now when people are either you're buying seedlings or you're growing them from seed, or you at the point where your seedlings are ready to be planted in the garden and you're not sure what's happening and if they're healthy or not. So I'm just going to offer you basically tips, but I'm going to couple that with the using your senses to determine whether something is doing well or not. Okay. So with seedlings, the most important part really is the soil. So if you're planting seeds, the moisture of the soil is going to be the most important thing that you need to listen to. Obviously, if you're buying just a basic seed starting soil mix, that's what I recommend if you're just starting out. You can mix your own if you'd like to. I honestly have never mixed my own. I just buy a bag from the store. Usually I buy organic, but if you're just getting started and you can't afford it or whatever, just buy whatever, just make sure it is a seed starting mix or something like that. Okay. So first, when I say the moisture of the soil, I think this is actually where most people get messed up when they start calling themselves they have a black thumb or whatever. They're either overwatering or underwatering. And so a trick that I have for determining whether something is the right amount of water, the right amount of moisture for a seedling, is by sticking my finger in the soil. And when I think back to my mother-in-law, this is something that she definitely did a lot of, sticking her fingers in the soil. And so I tried to help you picture what a good, healthy soil looks like by sticking your finger into the soil to determine whether it's the right moisture. And now this is, if you're using a standard seed starting mix, this will be good advice for you. If you're using something else, I'm not sure. Like this, I usually use a seed starting mix. So this is the way I determine it. I think it's pretty much the same because it's the moisture that you're kind of trying to figure out. And anyway, these are the tips that I have. So you stick your finger in the soil. When you stick your finger in the soil, like to your first knuckle, just stick it in there on the side of the seedling. And if there's freckles of dirt that come off to your finger, then it's good. If there's no dirt at all, if there's no freckles at all, then you probably need less water. So you're probably adding too much water, and you need to just give it a day or so to soak up that water. So we're using our senses here. So this is feel and sight, right? We're looking and feeling. If you happen to be like my friend Kelvin, who I am coaching, he is a deaf and blind, and he wants to be a homesteader. And you can listen to the episode where I coach him on episode 91 of this podcast as well. But if you happen to be listening, Kelvin, if you're listening, you would be using your touch more, obviously, than anything here. So if you do not feel any dirt on your finger, then you need to probably give the plant less water. If you do the same thing, and you have a ton of dirt on your finger, like a lot of dirt, then you probably need to add more water, okay? Because you're pulling your finger out, and by the way, you might want your finger to be a little bit damp at this point so that you can feel, just a little bit, not a lot. But I usually just stick my finger in, and it is the right consistency. But if it's covered in dirt, then it's, like normal dampness of your finger, maybe not like super wet. But anyway, this may not work. I don't know if this will work for you. This is the best I can teach you without showing you myself. But so what you really want is just a little bit of freckling of soil on your finger. That is how I determine the soil has enough moisture. So you may have to play around with this a little bit. I just highly encourage you to keep trying at this, because this is what makes this is what turns you from a black thumb to a green thumb, knowing whether the moisture of your seedling soil is the right moisture. Okay, the next tip I'm going to share is looking at the leaves. You can feel this as well, but I just highly recommend, if you're at this stage where you're not able to see the leaves, just to feel as best you can gently, okay? Because this is a very fragile stage of the seeds, and you can easily break the plant in half, and you can't. If you break the stem, there's pretty much no coming back from that. So look and see if the leaves are are wilted, or if they are, this is another way to tell whether the moisture is correct or not. If your leaves are wilted, that means it's struggling in some way or another. So it's most likely the water situation. It's not getting enough water. Okay. So you want to make sure that you are keeping that watered. And you don't want, although plants can come back from stress, you don't want them to get into stress very often. So just try to, eliminate the stress by keeping it watered regularly. And I will say this, I do not like the cardboard type containers for seedlings. And the reason is because the cardboard dries out too fast. And then, it doesn't hold in the moisture well enough. Yes, those might be good for planting directly in the soil, but they're not good for keeping the moisture in. And oftentimes they dry out first and then they start to dry out the center. So what I recommend actually is you just get the kinds with the cell trays that are individual, like a tray that has, 60 cells in it, or you get a empty tray, which this is what I usually do. You get a tray that has no cells in it. And sometimes they come with holes, sometimes they don't. I actually don't use the ones with holes because I know the soil that I want. So I just water according to my trick that I told you. If it looks like it needs water, I give it water. If it doesn't look like it needs water, I don't give it water. So I don't usually drench it in water so that it needs to drain very much. Okay. So, but if you feel like you want the holes, get the holes, or you can make your own holes. But I just use the trays with no cells in it. And I just plant in my rows, just pretend like it's out. It's like it's a big garden outside and you have rows. I just plant in rows and I put markers, like a little tag on the end of that row as to what it is. So I don't mix, if I'm doing squash, I'll do squash and cucumbers maybe in the same tray, but I won't do squash and tomatoes because they don't grow at the same rate, and you'll have all kinds of mess if you were trying to have a cover over it for the seeds to germinate, which is another thing. Okay, so I'm going all over the place with here, but just track with me here, okay? If you want if you're planting seeds, you want to make sure that you have some sort of dome cover or plastic over it, because that is what will help the seeds to germinate. And you want that greenhouse effect inside of this. Okay, the best way to get a seedling to grow is to do the greenhouse effect, and it needs to be more of a dome so that it has a little time for the rest of the seedlings to grow as well. So some might come out first. You want a little space so they can grow out while the other ones are waiting. Okay, sometimes you have to take the dome off before the other ones are ready, and sometimes the other ones grow, sometimes they don't. So, but you really want to make sure that you have that greenhouse effect as you're starting your seeds, if you're doing from seeds. Okay, so what I was saying was I usually get the tray that has no cells in it, and I put the soil in there. I plant my seeds in rows, just like if I was outside in a big garden. And I put a marker at the end of that row. And I make sure that I have a dome of some sort, cover. Usually when you get those trays, they come with the top. So it's just like a clear plastic. But you could make something if you wanted to. Just make sure there's space up above it. I try to get back to where I was before. I think I was talking about leaves. Okay, so first thing is that the first two leaves that come when your plant emerges are not their true leaves. They're called cotyledons, and they are just what's inside the seed that's coming out. So you want to protect it as good as you can during that phase until its true leaves come out, which are the next set of leaves. When the next set of leaves come out, and they're pretty established and grown, you can get rid of those cotyledons leaves. They usually start to get yellow and fall off by themselves. But if it is still sticking on there, you can pinch it with your fingernail very gently, or you can use scissors. But usually they just come off eventually. But if you want to give the mature plant more time, more energy to put into their growing leaves, you can get rid of those. So here we're talking about looking and observing your leaves. If they are burnt or pale looking or curled or generally unhealthy looking, there's something wrong, right? So go through your baby plant care checklist first, okay? So pretend like this is a baby, and if you're a parent, that you kind of go through a mental checklist, like, does she need a diaper change? Does she need a bottle? Or does she need to be nursed? Or does she need, just some comfort? So do that with your baby plants as well. So if they look wilted, if they look off, does it need water? We talked about that earlier, like if they're droopy, they might need water. Does the plant, or it could have too much water. It could be looking sick because you put too much water in there. Do the soil test with your finger. Does it need light? Some indications that a plant needs light is that it stretches, like it looks like it's just becoming this long tree with no leaves and no branches. Is it stretching up? Is it leaning towards the light? If it's leaning or falling over, that's usually a light issue. If you are like me and you're growing your plants in the window, which I have really big windows, so I get a lot of light in my house. So it's doable. Some people don't have enough light in their house, so this won't work. But if you happen to have big windows and like French doors or something like that, this would probably work for you. What I do is if it starts to lean in one direction, I turn it like once a day, maybe once every other day. I turn the plant so that it has to turn the other way next, so that it keeps it strong and upright. And it usually works pretty well. The nice thing about tomato plants, if you're doing this with tomatoes, they are pretty forgiving. You can get a tomato plant to go upright when it gets into the garden. If, other plants like squash and cucumbers, they are going to be laying down anyway. So for me, it doesn't really matter too much. I mean, I don't want it stretching out really tall first, but it's going to be laying down anyway when it gets into the garden. So those I don't worry about as much. But when you're looking at the leaves, you might have a light issue. If there's a lot of leaning and a lot of stretching, you probably need to be putting those under grow lights. And it might be too late if it's getting to that point. It might just be ready. You're going to have to put those outside pretty soon. But just know that that is something to observe. Okay. And if you're not sure if it's, stretching or not, go look at the plants at the nursery, or go feel the plants at the nursery. If you cannot see, go feel the plants at the nursery and see how they feel and how they look and how bushy they would be at that height if they were healthy and normal. Okay. So another thing to pay attention to is the root growth. Like, is the plant getting strangled by all the roots that are growing in the container? Is the container too small for the plant? Just being proactive here, you can save a lot of heartache, because it may look like your plant is really healthy, but then it's completely root bound, and then you're putting it under a lot of stress when you're trying to transplant it and that sort of thing. So just pay attention to like how tight that root seems like that's in there, and just transplant up. And here I'm going to give you some advice about transplanting as well. So transplanting is something that if you're growing from seed, you're more than likely you're going to have to transplant them from their seedling tray to something else, unless you're ready to put those directly into the garden, which you don't necessarily want to do that. You want to kind of gradually put them into another container and then harden them off, which is when you allow for a few, times of being outside, being in the wind, being in the sun, before you actually transplant the whole thing into the garden, because that puts them under a lot of stress, going from being inside this safe, windless place to a very different environment with a lot of beating down heat and that sort of thing. That really stresses them out. So you want to make sure that you have a hardening off transition period. But when you're transplanting your seedlings, you want to make sure that you are having a time for them to rest after the transplant. You want to make sure the soil that they're transplanting into is moist and good. And usually after the transplant, I just water them, top off, not top off, but water them again, just to make sure that the roots all the roots that are in there got enough water, and that that'll help them, during the transition. But a lot of times, even if you do that right, the plants start to droop, and they're like, this is stressful. Could be that you're using a different soil. Could be that just the temperature is different. I'm not even sure exactly why they go through it, because some of my plants do and some don't, even with the same conditions. It could be how I separated them. If there's multiple seedlings together, it could be that some got more stressed out than the others. So I just highly recommend that you give them a safe place to recover from the transplant. And I like to use my sink, my kitchen sink, or the bathtub if you have lots of plants, or just if you have a greenhouse. There you go. You just use your greenhouse. But it only takes an hour or so, and then they've recouped and they feel better, and then you can put them back to where they were before if you're growing, if you haven't put them outside yet. I wouldn't put those, if you're up, putting a seedling from one container to the next, I wouldn't then go start trying to harden them off, because that's just a lot of stress. Remember, we're trying to keep low stress. And I also realized as I was thinking about this, that transplanting, when we learn these lessons in gardening. There's so many lessons I learn in gardening. And one of them is when we have something big and stressful in our life, it is really important to give ourselves time to recuperate, and we need to rest and be in a safe place so that we can gain our strength back. And you will see amazing things happen with these seedlings. Sometimes they look like they're completely fallen over. There's just no hope for them. They're never going to make it. I put them in the sink for an hour or two, and then they're just popped right back up to the way they looked before. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and that's one that I like to share. Okay, so another thing I want to share is if you're second year gardening and you're you see all these little plants that look like the plant that you grew the last year. Tomatoes love to do this, by the way. They are volunteer tomato plants that will pop up in different spots on your property. And usually it's right there in the garden bed. So this would be for someone who is second year gardening. Utilize the transplants. Use them as much as possible. I will warn you, though, that the transplants don't always turn out to be the same as the parent plants. So that is because of cross-pollination. Usually this happens a lot with squashes and cucumbers. Actually, pretty sure cucumbers, but squash and pumpkins for sure. So it's because, they get cross-pollinated. The bees will go from one plant to the other, and they're easily cross-pollinated. So you just have to know that if you, and melons, this happens a lot with melons too. You just have to know that if you're letting those types of things, because those will reseed themselves too and show up in your garden as well, that they may be a mystery. They may be a mystery pumpkin or a mystery squash, but those are fun too. I do like that. I've had some mystery melons and mystery pumpkins as well. But it's just know that, that could happen. It can happen with tomatoes as well, but I don't think that's ever happened to me. And I've had all kinds of tomatoes in my garden. And if the next year it comes up, it's the same tomato. So it's possible though. It can also happen. I think it's just because the flowers are a little smaller. It's not as likely, but I'm not really sure why that is. But If you're saving seeds, you probably want to know that that's a big possibility, and like you don't sell the seeds if you have like a lot of mix of tomatoes in the same area. So just know that volunteer plants are wonderful, and you should take them out because they're usually really hardy, and if they have emerged from wherever you planted to the next year, especially like conditions like snow and all that kind of stuff, and they knew exactly when it was time to come out, save those suckers. They're stronger than the ones that you're probably growing in your house. Just separate them gently. They're usually in clumps. Tomatillos love to do this as well. They're usually in clumps, so you just like have to separate them gently, put them into their own spots. You don't have to put them in a pots if you don't want to. I wouldn't bring them inside. I would just leave them outside unless it's going to rain or something, because they could die. Not rain, but snow. If there's unexpected temperatures, you might want to protect them just like you would your other plants. But just remember that volunteers are great. So volunteer plants, use those as much as possible. Okay, so here's another couple tips. This is probably one of the longest episodes I've done for a solo, but I just felt like this information was really good for you. So here's another tip is pick weeds early. If you have a garden and, out in your garden, outside and not on your porch or something like that, or even on you can get weeds in your container gardens as well. But you want to make sure that you are picking the weeds as early as possible. They're so much easier to pick when they're babies, when they're little tiny than they are when they're big, and you have to, scrape them out. I highly recommend you get a hula hoe. If you don't have a hula hoe for your garden, you need to get one. They're very handy. They're just like a regular hoe, only they have a hole in them, so that's they grab weeds a lot easier. They take weeds out a lot easier, I've found. So in that same note with the picking the weeds early, learn how to recognize your plants as infants. We talked about them, we're talking about them like babies. Learn how to recognize your tomato seedlings, the little tiny ones I'm talking about, and your sprouting seeds. Learn how to recognize them and see what they look like, and so that if you have volunteers of anything in your garden, you can use them. You don't have to waste that. And I've had so many times where I have had something that I didn't have to grow in the house that year because I knew I would have so many of their volunteers, and I could just add those to my garden beds, So learn how to recognize them. There is an app called Picture This that I use that will help you. I'm pretty sure it helps with garden plants too. It helps with all plants as far as I know. But I use it a lot in woods when I'm in my woods, because there's a lot of plants here in Georgia that we did not have in California. And I use it to identify things because I don't know what those things are. So much more growth here. So it's called Picture This. It's free. There's a free version. And you can identify it as a seedling, as a sprouting, at different stages. It usually tells you what it is. So that you're not growing weeds. So you don't want to do which I have done this, and I don't know, I'm sure somebody listening to this right now has done this. Okay. I have pampered and nurtured weeds before because I thought, oh, that must be a plant that I need. And I have let it live until it got to adulthood. And then it's like, okay, you're a weed. I don't need you. But that's just a way to recognize, if you recognize the things that you want, you won't be accidentally growing weeds. It happens to the best of us. So earlier I talked about how you can use your senses, your sight, and you can look, feel, smell, and listen. And I didn't touch yet on what I meant by that, the smell and listen. That comes more in when your plants are producing fruit. They have, there's ways you can tell whether something is ripe by its smell. Okay, so you can use your nose to smell the stem of the plant. Sometimes you can smell where the stem is. This is what I do in the grocery store. You smell the stem area where the stem used to be. You smell the smell. If it smells strong like the fruit that you want, then it's probably ripe. If it doesn't, it's probably not ripe. That's one way you can tell with fruit. So this is like melons. I'm talking about melons and watermelons, okay? This works with pineapples as well. This doesn't always work with watermelons as much, but here's a tip that you can do with watermelons with sound. So you can thump the watermelon, and if it makes this thud sound, there's a certain sound that it makes, and you might need to look it up to better explain this, but there's a certain sound a ripe watermelon makes versus an unripe watermelon. And you could do this in the grocery stores because most of the ones in the grocery stores tend to be ripe. So you can listen to hear, not all of them, but they're at the ripening point, which is a lot harder to tell when a watermelon is at the ripening point in the garden. There you can look at the stem of the watermelon itself right by the fruit, and it tends to dry out when it's ripened. But it's easy to go from ripe to really ripe, so sometimes it's just good to have a few different ways to tell. Anyway, that is kind of all that I have to share today. I know that it was just kind of a random list of tips, but these are just some of the things. If I come up with other thoughts as I'm going through my garden season, I will definitely do another podcast episode about this, just some things that I come up as I'm gardening. We are expanding our garden. I am so excited because my husband has built, he built one of the 6 garden beds that we need. I'm not sure if we'll get all 6 this year, but we're working on it. And we used galvanized metal and wood, and they're really pretty. They're very deep though, so I have to fill them with, I'm doing more of a hugelkultur method. I'll talk about that at a different time. I'll probably actually have somebody on the podcast to talk about that because that would be fun. Okay, so that is it for today. I hope this was a good episode for you. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And don't forget, you can get the Homesteading for Beginners checklist. It is free, and it will help you to get started on your homesteading journey if you're just a beginner. Yeah, so that's it. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope you spend some of your day or your rest of your day or tomorrow in your garden or someone else's garden to learn more about how to be a green thumb gardener. Okay, talk to you next week.